It was 9:02 a.m. when Elias Monroe pushed through the double doors of the 10th floor boardroom at Whitmore and Langston Holdings, using both hands, steady despite his age. The meeting had already begun, and the room's elegant silence cracked with the unexpected groan of hinges and the slow shuffle of his worn slippers across the pale carpet. Suppressed laughter rippled at first, then a sarcastic remark came from the head of the table. "I think someone got lost on their way to the locker room," said Brandon Whitmore, the company's CEO, adjusting his Armani jacket without even glancing at Elias. Embarrassment spread among the executives, yet no one dared intervene. The old man did not reply immediately. He drew a well-worn leather portfolio from inside his dark coat and walked calmly to the center of the table. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," he said, in a firm, resonant voice, placing the portfolio in front of Brandon. "Before you make any decisions about the company's future, I suggest you read this." Silence fell. The laughter died. All eyes turned to the closed case. Brandon raised an eyebrow and chuckled low. "Now the janitor wants to join the meeting?" Elias merely met his gaze. There was a dangerous calm in his eyes, as if he harbored knowledge nobody there possessed. To understand how that quiet man came to that moment, we must go back 3 days, or perhaps 30 years. Elias was the building's longest-serving employee, though no one there knew it for certain. At 69, he had been sweeping those halls long before many executives even learned to tie their own shoes. He always arrived before sunrise and left only after the last floor lights flickered off. His presence was invisible, noticed only when someone complained about a smell, demanded he work faster, or brushed past him in polite indifference. He had no gold badge or reserved parking space, only a metal locker in the basement and the keys to every door. That Monday, as on many before, Elias arrived at 5:40 a.m. The building still slept. The hush of the ground floor greeted him like an old friend. Pushing his cleaning cart, he paused briefly to admire the framed photos lining the walls, executives at lavish events, all white, all smiling. In one, Brandon posed with folded arms before a projection screen, surrounded by applauding staff. Elias wiped the frame with almost ceremonial care. He remembered that night well, and how he was unceremoniously ushered out right after setting up the stage. Elias blended into the scenery unnoticed. One day, while cleaning the executive corridor windows, he overheard 2 managers discussing potential layoffs. "If we have to trim heads, start with that little old man with the rag," one joked. The other agreed, as though Elias were merely a number rather than a constant presence. The remark stung less than it would have 2 decades earlier. Elias had grown accustomed to the role assigned him. The cleaner, the bowed head, the invisible apology for existing. But inside he never vanished. He listened, he observed, he took note, and above all, he waited. For some battles aren't won by shouts, but by silence and patience. The gulf between Elias and Brandon was stark, not just in skin or tone, but in how they saw the world. Brandon was born into ownership, a company, a powerful name, a secure future. Young, handsome, ambitious, and blind with arrogance. An Oxford education, an MBA from Stanford, and the surname Whitmore placed him on an unchallenged pedestal. Elias, by contrast, hailed from Mobile, Alabama, grandson of sharecroppers, son of a railroad laborer and a public school cook. He held a mechanical engineering degree from a historically black college and had worked in 3 factories before taking the janitor's post as a temporary job. 40 years later, he was still there, not out of weakness, but by choice. While most saw only a grey uniform and a mop, Elias carried in his mind every number and name. He knew that the research department was slated for cuts, that layoffs would disproportionately hit women and minorities, that Brandon was redirecting internal funds to cover his own excesses, with the silent endorsement of the board. What no one knew was that Elias held copies, files, testimonies, and more crucially, a document signed by Gregory Whitmore, Brandon's father, naming Elias as a minority shareholder that, over time and through quiet acquisitions, would become a majority stake. It was the legacy of an old pact sealed over coffee one night when 2 men spoke of the future, but the time had not yet come to reveal it. First, they needed to dig their own graves. Elias continued his days as usual, pushing his cart, folding uniforms, polishing plaques bearing the name they spat at his face. He needed no approval from them, only the right moment. On Wednesday, he learned that talk of the restructuring plan had reached the project's committee agenda. The storm was forming, and he would be the final lightning strike. And if you've ever felt invisible, as though everything you do goes unseen, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the most powerful stories arise from the silence of those nobody wants to hear. The next morning, Elias was on the executive floor before the lights blinked fully on. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted from a still-locked office, and the click-clack of hurried heels echoed on marble. Clara Jennings, Director of Human Resources, appeared with her tablet under her arm and an impatient look. Seeing Elias polishing the stair railing, she wrinkled her nose. "Mr. Monroe, please avoid this floor after 7:30. We're hosting international investors today, and it would be best if we didn't look like a 1960s relic." Elias nodded silently. He'd heard worse over the decades when they didn't even bother with surnames. But that morning, Clara's words carried a different weight, not because they offended him, but because they confirmed what he needed. They were trying to hide the dirt while expelling the one who cleaned it. At 9:20, while gathering shredded papers in finance, Elias overheard loud laughter from the project committee room. Peering through a crack, he watched three men laugh as one pointed to a slide. "Cut logistics by 15% and throw the old man into the package. Bet he doesn't even have health insurance. Just a broom and some aspirin." They howled, one even imitating a hunchback pushing an imaginary cart. Elias didn't enter. He stepped away slowly. He was used to being the butt of jokes from men who barely knew the fuse box location, but the difference now was that he was recording. That morning, his pocket recorder hid under his grey apron was running. At lunch, Elias returned to the basement, where he kept his portfolio in a locked cabinet. He pulled out a thick envelope and began organizing the files he'd compiled over the years. Doctored accounting records, inflated service contracts, suspended project budgets still being paid. Most had escaped external auditors. Some trusted the reports they received, others never thought to listen to a janitor. But Elias knew how to cross-check figures. He could spot small discrepancies that pointed to massive fraud. He was more than an old man with a cart. He was a clandestine specialist, a wolf in rags. Heading back upstairs, he crossed paths with Brandon on the phone and striding briskly. Elias held the elevator door for him. Brandon paused, eyed him scornfully, and said without lowering his voice, "You know, they should institute a dress code for the cleaning staff. This place looks more like a bus terminal every day." Elias held the door without reply. Brandon stepped in, checked himself in the elevator mirror, and slicked his hair with his free hand. "And that old uniform, what happened? Thought they'd replaced it by now. Doesn't make sense to keep someone who doesn't even bother looking presentable." The doors closed. Elias kept his gaze on the panel, though inside his heart pounded not with anger, but with certainty. Every word, every disdainful look, was another nail in their arrogance's coffin. Around 2 p.m., while cleaning a glass partition in legal, Elias saw Brandon's assistant, a young woman named Tracy, struggling to print something. The printer jammed, as it often did, and she kicked the cabinet beneath it. "This building is as outdated as the people who work here," she muttered, glancing at Elias. He finished cleaning the last smudge and left, but he memorized her words as evidence, because that's what he was building. A dossier on the company's culture of contempt, not just toward him, but toward everyone who didn't fit the privileged bubble at the top. Late that afternoon, Elias was summoned to the HR reception. Clara Jennings awaited him, arms crossed, tense. "We've received a complaint you're eating in the basement supply closet. That's against policy." Elias nodded. "That's the only place I don't bother anyone," he replied. Clara sighed. "Regardless, the company has welfare rules, hygiene standards included. As of today, you must use the common area." Elias knew what that meant. The last time he tried to eat in the cafeteria, the serving staff ignored him and glared as if he'd crashed a summit meeting. Still, he said, "Of course, Ms. Jennings." But something stirred inside him. He would no longer be merely the man who yielded. He would be the man who responded, at precisely the right moment. Descending the service stairs, he glimpsed the city through a small round window. Cars, people, clocks, all proceeding as usual. But inside, something was about to change. Elias Monroe was no longer a janitor waiting for recognition. He was a shareholder, an engineer, a man tested to his limits, and he had decided to stop waiting. The next board meeting was scheduled. He knew the agenda. He knew the faces. Above all, he knew the impact he would make. The following morning, Elias arrived earlier than usual. His uniform was clean and pressed, but his decade-old boots remained the same. He passed through reception unnoticed, as always, and took the service elevator. En route to the executive floor, his phone vibrated. A silent alert that copies of the files had been uploaded to an encrypted server, part of a plan he'd honed for years. As the elevator doors opened, 2 interns stepped out giggling. Spotting Elias, they lowered their voices, but one couldn't resist. "Looks like he's here to inspect if we mopped properly." They laughed and walked on. Elias continued, his heart no longer indifferent but resolved. Their silence was not ignorance, but convenience, and perhaps that was why he waited so long to speak when no one could claim surprise. At around 10 a.m., Brandon and other directors gathered informally in the main pantry, discussing budget cuts and payroll changes. A few steps away, Elias was wiping a glass wall. Brandon spotted him and smirked. "That guy is the biggest long-term expense. He looks busy, but he's just waiting for retirement checks." A director chuckled. "At least he doesn't talk. Beats those admin people who complain about everything." Elias heard. Everyone heard. And at that moment he realized their silence was complicity. That was why he had waited, to confront them when they could no longer pretend ignorance. Returning to the basement for lunch, Elias found a note on his locker. "Please vacate this space by Friday. New supply room. Organization. Signed, Clara." He calmly peeled it off, opened the locker and retrieved his leather portfolio. That notice was the final signal. For years he'd been invisible. Now they were trying to erase him forever. But what they didn't know was they were giving him a stage. He would not wield anger as a weapon, but facts, the weight of documents, recordings, memories. The storm they'd sown with sarcasm, prejudice, and greed was about to break, and Elias would be its calm eye. Friday at 10 a.m. On the dot, the extraordinary board meeting began. Elias stood in the hallway, uniform immaculate, expression serene, as principal shareholders and directors filed in, distracted and arrogant, certain of their dominion. Brandon came in last, on the phone, laughing. "If all goes well, we'll cut 120 positions today, and still look like heroes of efficiency," he said, nodding slightly at Elias, without real recognition. Elias simply said, "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore." Brandon didn't answer. The door closed, muffling the world behind him. But Elias remained before the floor-to-ceiling glass reflecting the city, a man who knew time was on his side. Inside the room, Brandon began his presentation, distributing manipulated figures and glossed-over reports. He spoke of cuts and restructuring, of trimming the base to preserve the top. Miriam Holt, the longest-serving board member, raised her voice to question the social impact of the layoffs. Brandon cut her off with forced politeness. "With all due respect, Miriam, today's corporate world is no place for sentimentality." Soft laughter rippled around the table, but not everyone joined in. Tension rose and intensified when the door opened again and Elias walked in, steps unhurried, portfolio in hand. Silence struck immediately. Surprise and discomfort swept the room. "Mr. Monroe, this is a restricted area," said Clara, who had joined as an observer. Brandon straightened in his seat and smiled indulgently. "I think we've had an unintentional intruder. Could someone call security, please?" Elias said nothing. He stepped to the center, opened the leather case as calmly as he cleaned a pane of glass, and withdrew a single document. He laid it before Brandon. "Before any decision about this company's structure, it might be wise to review the original partnership agreement signed by Gregory Whitmore, dated 1987. Brandon laughed, shaking his head, but his laughter died when he peered more closely at the paper. Miriam leaned in to look. Her eyes widened. "Brandon, and this is—" Elias finished. "Yes, this is the original document granting me majority shareholding. Whitmore and Langston Holdings doesn't belong solely to you. It belongs to me as well." Absolute silence followed. Clara recoiled. Brandon went pale. A director murmured, This is serious." Elias produced more papers. Stock certificates, capitalization updates, irrevocable clauses. All signed, all legitimate. He had waited decades for this moment, not for vengeance, but to remind those who laughed at him that power and respect are distinct, and that sometimes the man who sweeps the floor is the same one who can shut the door on you. In the minutes that followed, pale faces, restless hands, and stifled breaths marked the aftermath of his revelation. Brandon scrambled for a verbal escape, some way to discredit the document. This is impossible. My father would never do that. There must be an error. Can someone verify its authenticity? But Miriam, already holding the contract, spoke before anyone else. This is my husband's notary seal, and that is Gregory's unmistakable signature. She looked slowly at Elias, and for a moment her astonishment melted into respect. Elias stood firm. He needed say no more. The paperwork spoke for him. One counselor whispered to legal, who hurriedly exited. Brandon searched for allies in the room, but his arrogance dissolved under truth's weight. Even if this were valid, he tried, you have no right to interfere in management. Elias offered his first smile in days, small, controlled, yet laden with unwavering certainty. For 30 years I've watched you turn this company into a vanity showcase. I've witnessed talent discarded, ideas stifled, lives terminated in the name of spreadsheets. Now, it's my turn to be heard. The ensuing silence was not shock, but shame. Clara attempted to interject, insisting a legal review was needed, but Elias anticipated that. He withdrew the company. Bylaws signed by her and Brandon, confirming founder agreement validity and automatic rights transfer absent revocation clauses. Clara paled. Brandon slumped in his chair as if the room's air had thinned. For the first time, words failed him. Elias, by contrast, stood tall with resolute eyes. For decades they laughed at him. Now none could meet his gaze. The next moments were filled with urgent phone calls and legal verifications, while Elias remained unbowed at the room's center. By meeting's end, the board decided to take 72 hours to review the documents. Elias distributed certified copies to everyone present, and before exiting said, I'm not here to destroy what my old friend Gregory built. I am here to save it from what you turned it into. Then he left as he'd entered, silently, with dignity, not as the invisible man in grey, but as the rightful steward of the company's future. Outside in the corridor, employees gathered in hushed curiosity. No one knew exactly what had happened. Inside, but all felt the shift. Elias walked among them without a word, but his posture, head held high, shoulders back, said it all. At reception, Tracy, the same assistant who'd sneered at him days before, lifted her eyes from her screen and instinctively stood. Elias met her gaze with quiet firmness. Good morning, Mr. Monroe, she whispered. He nodded and continued on. The gears had turned, and though none fully understood how, they knew the world had changed. Brandon remained behind in the boardroom after adjournment. The other directors slipped out in silence, avoiding eye contact. Miriam was the last. Pausing behind Brandon's chair, she said calmly, Your father believed that power without humanity is success masquerading as failure. I don't think you ever grasped that. Brandon had no reply. What could he say? For the first time, the throne he occupied trembled, and the threat did not come from a hostile investor or the press, but from someone he'd never considered a player, and that someone now held the game. Back in the basement, Elias opened his old locker and took the leather portfolio one last time. He reverently flicked through the papers, no longer a shield, but a testament. He drew out a handwritten letter from Gregory Whitmore, kept for decades, thanking him for his loyalty, vision, and courage. You saw value when no one else did. This company is as much yours as mine. Use this as you see fit, in due time. Elias slipped the letter into his pocket and, for the first time in many years, closed the locker door without locking it. The silence had ended. Now it was time to act. The following hours wrought a silent earthquake through Whitmore and Langston. Rumors blazed across departments. Elias was a secret heir. Someone claimed he'd bought the company at a judicial auction. No one knew the truth, and tension soared. Most striking was Brandon's silence. He hadn't left his office since the revelation. Blinds drawn, lights out, no visitors allowed. The man who once filled corridors with his presence was now sequestered like a court adolescent. The company felt a leadership vacuum, and for the first time, there was no plan B. Clara Jennings was among the first to feel the turn of tide. Still haughty, but her stride harsher, her demeanor strained. The legal department summoned her for an urgent meeting to explain her approval of clauses benefiting Elias that she'd dismissed as irrelevant. She defended herself, claiming she never imagined that man was more than a service contractor. The leak of that phrase circulated unkindly among staff. If they treat Monroe that way, imagine how they talk about us. Internal trust began to crumble, not because of the ouster, but by the realization they'd all lived under a cruel illusion. Meanwhile, Elias returned to his routine as if nothing much had changed. He still swept corridors, organized cleaning supplies with care, greeted all with kindness, but there was something new about him. Not superiority, but quiet authority. Staff straightened at his approach. Executives no longer cracked jokes aloud. A marketing intern asked, "Is he going to be the new CEO?" No one could answer. Elias never mentioned positions. He only sought to restore the company's dignity. For him, the deeper cleaning required was beyond any floor polish. Brandon, however, was collapsing under pressure. In the days that followed, his attempts to reverse the situation were thwarted by lawyers confirming Elias's documents. The board, now conscious of internal morale, began to distance itself from the young heir. Miriam Holt discreetly proposed forming a transition committee. Brandon learned of this Tuesday afternoon and for the first time in years found himself speechless at a meeting. "Are you betraying me?" he asked the board. But it was not betrayal, it was accountability. What had crumbled was not only confidence in his leadership, but the very mask he'd worn too long. In the cafeteria, whispers about Elias shifted, from rumors to open respect. Workers who once avoided his gaze now greeted him sincerely. A maintenance technician, an old friend, invited him to dinner at the same table, something unthinkable months earlier. Elias accepted naturally, said little. He did not seek celebration. He wanted the company to learn to see beyond appearances, and as that began to happen, piece by piece, it became clear his mission was only beginning. Brandon, now isolated, showed signs of disorientation. Hours locked in his office, unanswered emails, meetings declined. His face looked pale, his gestures jittery. He tried persuading a major investor to intervene, but was told bluntly, "I'm not here to protect vanity. I'm here to protect results. And so far, Mr. Monroe has earned more respect than you." Brandon hung up in stunned silence. For the first time, he felt what it meant to be ignored, discarded, and that pain began to fracture his self-image. That same week, Elias received an unusual note. Brandon wanted to meet no lawyers in private. The message arrived via the assistant, who looked uncomfortable. "He asked you to see him," she said. Elias paused, gazing out the window at the city's usual rush, then replied simply, "Yes." The meeting was set for the next morning in the old boardroom, where everything began. And for the first time, no conflict awaited, only something Elias recognized from afar: remorse. On the morning of the meeting, Elias arrived early in his clean uniform, though he'd swapped his ancient boots for a discreetly polished pair. He moved with calm purpose, no hurry. In the boardroom, the mahogany table still bore scuffs and scratches, evidence of past battles. Brandon arrived late, shoulders heavy from sleeplessness, collar open, eyes hollow. No cameras, no witnesses, just the two of them. They sat, the silence thick. Brandon cleared his throat. "I don't know where to start." Elias simply waited, patient as one who had heard far emptier words. "I had no idea," Brandon said. "I mean, I knew of an old contract, but no one told me Dad left part of the company to you." Elias nodded. "Because it wasn't meant as a bargaining chip. It was trust. Dad believed in me, not for my position, but for my insight." Brandon lowered his gaze. "And I believed you were just the janitor." The words hung like an echo. Elias remained silent, letting the pause speak. Brandon grasped at excuses. "I was raised to think certain things natural. Division of roles, the way people were treated." Elias interrupted for the first time. "And you never stopped to ask if it was fair?" Brandon said nothing. For the first time, he had no ready retort. "I thought I was fair," he whispered, "doing what was necessary to keep the company alive." Elias leaned back. "It's not about keeping a company alive. It's about preserving humanity within it." The words struck like a mirror. Brandon looked away, fidgeting with the table's edge. "You're right. And I don't know how to fix this." Elias drew a breath. "It doesn't fix in a day, and it can't be mended with apologies alone. If you truly want to change, you'll have to start with yourself. Face what you did, what you allowed, what you ignored. Accept that the pain you feel now may be one you'll carry for a long time." The remainder of their conversation was quieter than words. Brandon listened more than he spoke. Elias, seeking not vengeance but transformation, made clear, if you're willing to learn, to listen, to work genuinely, you may still have something to offer this company. Brandon nodded, tears brimming yet contained. On leaving, he extended his hand. Elias surveyed it a moment, then clasped firmly. A simple gesture, one not sealing forgiveness, but the start of a journey, difficult, protracted, and deeply necessary. In the days that followed, Brandon stepped back from his role at Elias's insistence. "You need to learn before you lead," he told him. Instead of retreats to corner offices, Brandon spent time in departments. He once ignored reception, maintenance, supplies. He learned the names of technicians, the stories of assistants, the very people who kept the company standing without credit. He listened. Slowly, profoundly, he began to understand what leadership meant, that a company's value lies not in PowerPoints, but in the hands that hold up the floors when everything trembles. One afternoon, Brandon sat alone in the cafeteria, eyes on an untouched meal. Elias joined him at the table, as if evaluating a student's progress. "How's it going?" Elias asked gently. Brandon looked up, surprised. "Hard," he admitted. "Hearing what they really think of me." Elias nodded. "This is just the beginning. What you do with it is what matters." Brandon exhaled. "I want to do better, but I'm not sure people will ever forgive me." Elias regarded him for a long moment. "Some things aren't forgiven, they're overcome, but it takes persistence and humility." Brandon agreed, and in that instant, something shifted in his expression. Pride remained but cracked, and through the fissures light began to shine. That week, Elias convened an informal meeting of the company's leaders, not to announce draconian changes or sack executives, but to propose a new program, an internal cycle on ethics, empathy, and corporate social responsibility. Brandon would be the first enrollee, not as an exemplar, but as a student. "If we're going to rebuild, it must start from within," Elias said. Many expected punishments or layoffs. Instead, Elias offered something harder, real change. "I want you to learn to see, not just with your eyes, but with respect. Because when we don't see others as equals, we build a blind company, and eventually it trips." No one dared dissent. The program, named Root Project, became an active learning cycle, listening sessions, real employee stories, practical empathy exercises. Brandon, removed from executive duties, attended each session, absorbing accounts from those never before heard at board level. The security guard who slept on buses between shifts to save fare. The accountant who hid tears in the restroom after jokes about her northeast Brazilian roots. The maintenance worker passed over for promotion for lacking leadership traits. Despite decades of expertise, Brandon listened. No defense could stand before their pain. In one session, a young service desk employee shared, "I spilled coffee in the president's office once, and he told me people like me should be cleaning, not serving." She stared at Brandon without naming names. He offered no excuse, simply lowered his head. Afterward, he found her in the corridor and apologized, not theatrically, but sincerely, almost shyly. She replied, "I don't want an apology. I just want you never to treat anyone as inferior again." In that moment, Brandon realized true remorse seeks repair, not reconciliation. By the program's second month, Brandon had visited every company area, spent days in maintenance and archives, and humbled himself before the staff. But his deepest transformation occurred out of sight. At home, poring over old photos of his father, he recalled Gregory's words, "To lead is not to be seen. It is to see first." At the time, he'd thought it philosophical. Now he felt its painful truth. He had led blind, leaving scars. In a symbolic gesture, he emptied his top-floor office and moved to a simpler room on the 5th floor, near operational teams. "No leader should be isolated," he told. "Questions. Many watched skeptically, which he accepted. He knew that regaining trust would be slow, perhaps never complete. But for the first time, he was willing to walk the path without shortcuts. Elias, learning of this, said nothing. He understood that certain lessons must be lived in silence without applause or spectators. Evolution often happens when no one's watching. One rainy, late afternoon, Brandon went to the rooftop terrace, gazing at the city lights, pondering how much time he'd squandered proving power, when true power lay in acknowledging limitations. Elias appeared without announcement, as though summoned by the moment. "Are you still angry with me?" Brandon asked. Elias smiled gently. "No, but I remember everything, and memory differs from burden." Brandon, moved, nodded. "I'm still rebuilding." Elias laid a hand on his shoulder. "Rebuilding takes work, but it creates something that never existed before." The next month, the board formalized a new management structure. Elias declined the presidency. His role was restorer, not occupant. He nominated Miriam Holt as interim CEO, with Brandon returning in a subordinate capacity. Some were shocked, but Elias explained, "Leadership is learned by serving." Brandon accepted without hesitation. At their first meeting under the new order, he sat across from the table he once led, and for the first time in ages, listened more than he spoke. That was proof of his change. Not a new title, but a new stance. Now he was ready to start afresh. Those initial months under new leadership were challenging. Miriam's ethical, firm approach established a horizontal leadership model. Voices once ignored gained a place in decisions. Regular meetings included representatives from all departments. The cafeteria was redesigned, so leaders and staff shared the same space. Most importantly, an anonymous internal channel for complaints and suggestions was created, an idea from Brandon, who personally reviewed submissions daily. The goal was to listen and act, and the response began to resonate through Whitmore and Langston's halls like never before. Though no longer on the strategic front lines, Elias was invited as a special board advisor. He attended quarterly meetings, but his greatest impact lay in small moments: a whispered suggestion in the elevator, a thought-provoking question at day's end. He became a figure of unquestioned respect, not for formal power, but for moral authority. New hires learned his name. From day one, as part of the company's institutional story, long-time employees, once indifferent, now regarded him with contained gratitude. He had done what few dared: reveal truth without shouting, change everything without tearing anyone down. Brandon, in turn, used his journey as a model. He began leading small internal workshops on privilege awareness and active listening, opening each session with a brutally honest line: "For years, I was the kind of leader I now oppose." These sessions were tough. Some cried, others bristled at harrowing accounts. But gradually, the invisible walls dividing departments crumbled. A forklift operator was invited to suggest logistical improvements. A receptionist, long underestimated, was promoted to supervisor. The company culture was shifting, and it came from within. In one session, a young analyst stood and said to Brandon, "Thank you for not running from who you were, because that gives me courage not to repeat the same mistakes." Brandon did not speak immediately. He simply nodded, eyes glistening. He knew that recognition was not approval, but trust. Elias, watching from the back, felt a rare tightening in his chest. Not sorrow, but tangible hope. The man before him, once a symbol of arrogance, had become a mirror for many, not for what he'd been, but for what he chose to become. One day, after a routine afternoon, Brandon entered the former basement supply room, now a dignified break room. In its center stood Elias's old metal locker, preserved as a symbol, now fitted with a stainless steel plaque reading, "Here the change began." Brandon touched it reverently, then sat in the new armchair placed nearby, eyes closed in silence. He reflected on how great transformations arise not from grand declarations, but from silent acts, sustained daily. In that stillness, he reaffirmed his commitment, not to the company, but to each person within it. At the next year's anniversary assembly, Miriam invited Elias to speak. The hall was packed with employees at every level, board members and press. Elias stepped onto the makeshift stage in simple, elegant attire, took the microphone, scanned the audience, then said, "I'm not here to recount my deeds. I'm here to remind you what we all can do. When we see someone as less, we blind ourselves. When we give voice to those always silenced, we create not just a better company, but a possible humanity. A deep, unhurried applause followed. More than gratitude, a recognition of truth. Behind the scenes, Brandon watched with a mix of admiration and humility. This was the dawn of a new cycle, and he was not the protagonist, but the apprentice. After the event, he approached Elias. "Thank you for not giving up. On me, this company, the truth." Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "I did only what needed doing. The rest, you chose." In that moment, no titles or salaries mattered. Only two men. One who waited for the right moment, and one who finally learned to listen. Time passed, and Whitmore and Langston gained renown not just for corporate performance, but for social integrity. Media outlets hailed the company as an ethical reorganization model. Invitations to speak and collaborate poured in. Yet the company refused commercial offers. "We won't sell conscience," Miriam said in an interview. "We'll share it." Thus, Whitmore and Langston became more than a respected corporation, a living school of transformation. A firm that understood reputation is built by actions, and the greatest example came from one who never sought the spotlight. Despite recognition, Brandon never forgot his roots. He kept an anonymous letter, the first he read after Elias's revelation, in his car. "I never thought someone like me would have a chance. Now I believe I might have a voice." That sentence became his beacon. In moments of doubt, he reread it and asked, "Would Elias be proud of me?" Though no explicit answer came, he felt the compass Elias left him, steadfast, guiding toward justice. The following spring, a fresh cohort of trainees arrived, students from diverse backgrounds, public schools, social projects, realities once neglected by the old model. During orientation, Brandon greeted each one. When a shy newcomer asked why he, and not a director, was there, he calmly replied, "Because I learned from someone who was never a director, that the most important welcome comes from someone who once made mistakes." Silence reigned briefly, then collective smiles. And thus, another generation began its journey, not under a concrete roof, but within a legacy of conscience. Elias Monroe's name never adorned a boardroom wall nor graced marketing materials, but it was the most spoken name in Whitmore and Langston's corridors, always with reverence, always with learning. It was common to hear Elias would have done it differently, or let's think as Elias would have. He became an ethical lodestar, an invisible compass embedded not in walls, but in culture, in daily acts, a colleague helping another, a manager asking before ordering, a leader listening before acting. Elias needed no physical presence. His legacy lived on in the small decisions of many. Brandon often visited Elias's former basement locker, now a discreet memorial. Alongside the badge and Gregory's letter lay a small notebook of Elias's scattered thoughts, seeds for the future. One page bore a phrase in blue ink: "Don't wait for the position to do right. Do right, and the rest follows." Brandon read it so often that it became his mantra. In tough decisions, he closed his eyes and repeated it, like hearing Elias's voice again, a voice that did not shout, yet pierced all barriers. On the company's founding day, a special ceremony renamed rooms with symbolic titles. The old auditorium was christened Elias Monroe Auditorium, and beside the plaque, an art installation featured faces of the longest-serving staff, true company pillars. When curtain revealed the name, spontaneous applause erupted. Tears silently wiped. Elias was not there in person, but his presence was undeniable, enduring as long as the company thrived. Though years passed, Brandon never allowed himself to forget. During one challenging night, after a project failure, he wandered the empty building and sat in the last row of the auditorium before Elias's namesake plaque. He recalled the day he'd laughed at Elias, felt the fleeting power he once had, and the fragility of that power. In that moment he realized it wasn't about winning but sustaining what is built, and what Elias built cannot be measured in reports. It's rarer, more essential. Trust, reparations, a reminder that any empire ignoring human dignity is destined to collapse, sooner or later. In a later interview, Miriam was asked what made the transformation possible. Her answer: truth. When pressed, she added, "A truth hidden for years, ignored out of vanity." denied out of convenience, and finally revealed through courage. The interview went viral, and Elias Monroe's name surfaced in academic books, lectures, and conferences, but the greatest recognition remained off-stage, in how every employee was treated, in the silence before each major decision. New leaders at Whitmore and Langston all knew the story, and more than knowing it, they lived its lessons. During orientation, they watched an internal documentary on Elias's journey, then each wrote a letter to themselves promising to keep alive listening, respect, and empathy. Brandon often read some aloud. One read, "If I ever hold power, may I never forget my roots and have the courage to honor those who brought me here, even if I did not see." He kept that letter because it summed up all that must continue to be remembered. Years rolled on. The company changed headquarters and expanded globally, yet Elias Monroe's name never vanished from walls or hearts. He seemed present in every respectful gesture, in every meeting where all voices were heard, in every moment someone was listened to. Without shouting, he left no paper heirs but heirs of conscience, people who learned from him not through speeches, but by example. Brandon, now older, hair grey and steps slower, still spoke of him with undimmed emotion. "He was the only man who taught me what neither books nor my father could. Elias taught me to be a man before wanting to be a leader." One quiet afternoon, Brandon returned to the basement memorial and placed a note on the locker. "I keep trying." It was a simple promise, a pledge that Elias's work wasn't complete but ongoing, because what Elias built wasn't a perfect system or a model firm, but a deeper call to consciousness, a reminder that no title, office, or degree substitutes the human gaze. The truest power lies in recognizing the other. Humility is never a disadvantage. Many wondered how Elias endured so long being invisible, how he bore insults, contempt, neglect. The answer lay in his gait, always looking ahead. He knew days of disrespect didn't define him. His identity was larger than his uniform. His mission extended beyond corridors. His courage was not loud but constant. He did not wait for the system to change. He remained whole until the system could no longer ignore him. And when it did, he did not shout. He merely revealed who he always was. Elias's story is not only about justice, but persistence, how time does not diminish the worth of someone who waits with purpose, and how the silence of the unseen can be more transformative than the speeches of those on top. His journey reminds us the world does change, but it begins where no one is looking, in every overlooked corridor, every forgotten storage room, every person resolved to do right when no one cares. Elias proved that what is invisible to the eyes is often what shapes the future most profoundly. If you've made it this far, perhaps this story reminded you of someone, or even of yourself. If you have ever been silenced, underestimated, or ignored, know that your story matters too, and may hold the key to changing everything around you. So share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below where you're watching from, and if this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, because stories like Elias Monroe's need to be remembered and multiplied. Years later, a young intern who had just joined Whitmore and Langston went down to the basement by mistake, looking for the IT room. Upon entering the old maintenance wing, she came face to face with Elias's memorial. She read the plaque, observed the objects, and paused before the phrase engraved in steel, "No one is too small to change everything." Not fully understanding but feeling something stir in her chest, she took a photo with her phone. Later, when she asked a colleague who Elias Monroe was, she heard in reply, "He was the one who taught all of us to look properly." The intern didn't ask anything more. She simply smiled. Sometimes greatness needs no explanation, only presence. In the main boardroom, where for decades decisions had been made by the few, there was now a circular arrangement of identical chairs, all at the same height. The plaque listing the company's president still hung there, but beside it was a new frame, a blank sheet bearing the phrase, "Leadership begins when listening outweighs ego." This was the principle Elias left behind, a daily reminder that true transformation doesn't start in the highest offices, but in the humblest gestures. With each new generation of leaders, this teaching was passed on, not as an obligation but as an honor. Brandon, now retired, still visited the company occasionally. He would sit on the benches in the atrium, watch the comings and goings, talk with trainees, and smile at the small actions that revealed how much everything had changed. Once he left a note at Elias's memorial containing only one sentence: "Listening has become culture. Thank you for having started it." Then he walked out to the street, his step slower but his heart light. He knew that his story, despite all its mistakes, had become part of something greater, not through redemption, but through responsibility. And that, he had learned from Elias, was the true legacy. And so ends the story of Elias Monroe, a man who entered rooms that despised him in silence, who endured in the quiet of cramped closets, who never needed to shout to be remembered, and who changed the course of an entire corporation simply by being himself, upright, attentive, patient. If this story inspired you, share it, because the world is full of invisible men and women, waiting for someone at last to truly see them.